A feature that exists in the stories of the Bible is the ways in which God is always challenging the status quo. Actually, you know what? Can I pray? Just that, God can fix what is broken and make it all cool. God, I pray that you'll just take these next few minutes that we're going to spend together and take whatever thoughts that I share and put them in your amazing blender and bring out something that is new and fresh and useful for the lives that we lead here in Ottawa. Amen. Amen. So, a feature that exists in all the stories in the Bible are the ways in which God is constantly changing the status quo of people's lives. Now, because we exist in God's story in this space and time, we do not know what the end of God's story is for sure. But one thing we know is that God is a God of movement. There is movement all around us. This planet that we're on is moving and spinning and changing. This planet that we're on is chasing the sun around the center of the galaxy that is moving and spinning and chasing. The galaxy is spinning in space further and further away from other galaxies. There is a movement that is happening in all of creation. Inside the molecules inside of us, there is movement and motion. In order for water to change from one state to another, the molecules have to move either faster or slower. There is always movement in this big, beautiful world that God has created. But something that we come to understand is that the more that we know about the world, the more we realize that there is stuff outside of the margins that we know. The people who discovered planets keep discovering planets further and further. The people who are into theoretical physics keep discovering newer and newer things. People in chemistry, in biology, in history, in geography, in every single aspect of life, there's always something that is outside of the margins that we know. There is movement and change happening outside of the reaches that we already that we know of. We see it in humanity. When you're getting to know each other, you start to realize that the more that you know about someone, the more you realize you didn't know them. And the more you realize that there is more to know about them. I've been married for, 11 years, coming up on 12 years? And still to this day, my wife will say or do something that surprises me. I'm like, wow, I didn't know that about you. And it's actually taught me to not take her for granted. My child, my daughter, whom I've known since she was born, I spend more time with her than my wife does. I'm a stay-at-home dad. I work from home. That might change in the future, but right now, the bulk of the time is the two of us. I take her to school and I pick her up from school and whatever, and even just this holiday, she did things and said things that surprised me. I thought I knew her well, but even in her mind, even in her supervised little world, there are things happening that I cannot see, that I cannot control. There's stuff happening in her lives. We see it I've mentioned it already, in science. The more that you know, the more that you realize that there's stuff happening outside of the margins. And I'm persuaded that it is this outside of the margins stuff that God uses to really change our stories. You see, God has a way of taking us to the edge of what we know and then opening doors to show us that there is even more for us to learn. And he does this because the story that he's writing about us individually and collectively is actually more compelling than the story that we're in or the one that we're writing about ourselves. You see, at Pivot 613, we're constantly talking about this word, stories. If you spent any time with us, if you continue to walk with us, you find that we continually talk about stories. Our story, the one that we're in, the one that people say about us, and God's story about us. And the reason for this is that the story that you tell about yourself has a very powerful impact on who you are and how you live. Sometimes the stories that other people tell about you can exercise influence over who you are. They can get in there and start to exercise influence over who you are. God, I believe, is also writing a story that we can participate in willingly, or a story that we can choose to reject and write our own story. In fact, it is baked into our vision statement. The vision statement of Pivot 613 says, we're changing the stories of people's lives through grace and mercy and love. Because when we encounter God's grace and mercy and love, it changes us from lives that are fearful and cringing and judgmental and condemning, actually. God removes us from fear and replaces it with love. God removes us from a space of judgment and replaces it with grace. God removes us from a space of condemnation and replaces it with mercy. And in so doing, he changes our paradigm. He changes us from the inside out. This is what we believe. This is why we say we're changing the stories of people's lives through grace and mercy and love. Because we've come to understand that when God encounters us on the roads of our lives, he changes our stories. Now, the Bible is filled with stories of God challenging people to move outside of the boundaries of their lives. Now, when you read the Bible, the histories of the people in which these stories are located, because we're so far from them, we can sometimes forget that the things that they went through were actually groundbreaking for them. When we read them from our 21st century perch, we can go, like, how backward are these guys? Like, they owned slaves and they had concubines, and oh my gosh, and they basically practiced genocide. Like, what was going on? But because we are in a 21st century context, we can sometimes forget how brutal and how crazy it was back then, and how for them that was normal. I'm sure that 100 years from now, 200 years from now, people will look back at us and go, what? You sucked this black stuff from out of the earth and drove cars and planes around with it? They're going to think we were crazy for running the world on oil. At some point, people are going to look back at us and call us Neanderthals. And that is the problem of reading the Bible without understanding its context. You see, in the stories of the Bible, in one of the early stories, there's a guy called Abraham. And Abraham, he's actually the father of three major world religions. The biggest world religion is the one that we belong to. I do not consider myself to be a religious person, but for purposes of this discussion, we'll use the word religion. So Christianity is an Abrahamic religion. Islam is an Abrahamic religion. It's the second largest in the world. And Judaism is the third Abrahamic religion. And all of these religions kind of trace their lineage and their history back to Abraham. Now, Abraham was not a God follower when we meet him in the Old Testament. He was just a guy living somewhere in the Middle East. And they had a system of worship that had lots of different gods. And now, one of the things that happened, if you look back in ancient history, if you look back to the way that people were searching for deity and Godhead, is it came out of their understanding of the earth. They looked at the earth around them and they saw that there was movement, that there was day and night, that there was something, some body that kind of moved through the sky. We call it the moon. And that the moon it exercised influence over, like, the movement of the oceans and that kind of thing. They realized that the clocks in women's bodies were synchronized with the movement of this celestial thing in the sky. They realized that there were seasons, that there was rainy season and cold season and dry season and harvest and planting and everything. And then they started to realize that even though there was movement and even though there seemed to be a kind of way that you could predict what was coming, there was also stuff that you couldn't predict. There was this unknown space. Sometimes the harvest was good, sometimes the harvest wasn't good. Sometimes the women's clocks were synchronized with the moon in the sky. Sometimes they weren't. Sometimes women had babies, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes babies died at birth, sometimes they didn't. And so they started to think, you know what? This thing that is in charge of what we don't know, when things go bad, we need to do something to make that thing or those things happy. So the God of the harvest, the thing that is in charge of the crops, we had a bad harvest last year, so let's do something. Let's offer up a sacrifice. Maybe that will make the God of the harvest happy. The God of childbearing, the child died last time. Let's offer up something. Let's offer up a sacrifice. We see it actually in the Bible, in the story of Cain and Abel. Cain, in the biblical story, is a farmer. And so he takes of his crop and he offers it up to God. The Abel is a livestock, whatever. He takes care of livestock. And so he takes some from his livestock and he offers it up to God. That is consistent with this story that Abraham emerges from. But what happens if you offered grain to the God of the harvest and then you still had a bad harvest? Does that mean that the God of the harvest is angry with you? So what then do you offer next? Do you offer a bigger harvest? What do? Do you offer an even bigger harvest? Do you offer money? What do? You can see how this starts to escalate. What if, I didn't bear a child and I offered this and it didn't work, and I offered that and it didn't work? What bigger thing am I going to offer to make this God of this thing happy? And eventually, we end up offering, in this construct, in this history of humankind, people started to offer their children. And so human sacrifice, if you look back in history, if you look back in the history of religions, they all have a history of human sacrifice. The Middle East, Europe, Asia, Africa, South America, North America, they've all developed this thing of human sacrifice. What is the ultimate sacrifice you can make to make the gods happy? And it is into this context that we find Abraham. It is into this context that God breaks into Abraham's margins and then pushes them out. Let's read it together. Genesis 22. After this, God tested Abraham, saying, "Abraham." "Yes," answered Abraham, "I'm listening." He said, "Take your dear son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the Mount of Moriah." Do you think Lord of the Rings stole it from there? Anyway, go to the Mount of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I'll point out to you. Abraham got up early in the morning and saddled his donkey. He took 2 of his young servants and his son Isaac, and he had split wood for the burnt offering. He set out for the place that God had directed him. On the 3rd day, he looked up and he saw the place in the distance, and Abraham told his 2 servants, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I are going up there to worship, and then we'll come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and gave it to Isaac, his son, to carry, and he carried the flint and the knife, and the 2 of them went off together. Isaac said to Abraham, his father, "Father." "Yes, my son." "We have flint and wood, but where's the sheep for the burnt offering?" Abraham said, "Son, God will see to it that there is sheep for the burnt offering." And they kept walking together. They arrived at the place to which God had directed him, and Abraham built an altar. He laid out the wood, and then he tied up Isaac and laid him on the wood. Abraham reached out and took the knife to kill his son, and just then an angel of God called out to him out of heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Yes, I'm listening." "Don't lay a hand on that boy. Don't touch him. Now I know how fearlessly you fear your God. You didn't hesitate to place your son, your dear son, on the altar for me." Abraham looked up. He saw a ram caught by its horns in the thicket. Abraham took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. Abraham named that place God Yireh. God sees to it. And that's where we get the saying, "On the mountain of God, he sees to it." The angel of God spoke from heaven a second time to Abraham. "I swear, God's sure word, because you have gone through with this and have not refused to give me your son, your dear son, I will bless you. Oh, how I'll bless you. And I'll make sure that your children flourish like stars in the sky, like sand on the beaches, and your descendants will defeat their enemies. All the nations of the earth will find themselves blessed through your descendants because you obeyed me. This story messes with me because I have a child. Now, on the surface, it may seem like the test that God is taking Abraham through is a test of obedience. It looks like that, doesn't it? Indeed, Abraham must have thought it was a test of obedience. But we have to remember his context of human sacrifice. We have to remember that to Abraham, God asking him to sacrifice his son was a normal thing. But I think God's test was different. I think that God's test was a test of trust. Do you trust me to work in ways that are beyond what you know? What you know is a paradigm of human sacrifice. But could there be something bigger, something better, something outside the margins that is more powerful than what you know? I think there is. And it turns out that there is. Because God's lesson at the end of this test is that trust and faith are the true currency with him. Abraham could not have known that God was going to provide a ram. He could not have known that. All he did was he obeyed, but I think there was a next step, a step of trust and faith. We do not need to spill blood in order to please God. I think that that is the lesson that God is bringing Abraham to. That you do not have to sacrifice your son to gain favor with me. You do not have to kill your child to gain points with me. God challenges Abraham by pushing up against the margins of his faith experience and by breaking the mold that he was in. And in so doing, he sets himself up and his descendants on a path that will eventually lead to Jesus. Because eventually you see that the descendants of Abraham, the children of Israel, baked into their laws the fact that you would not sacrifice humans. In fact, God used them to carry out his judgment on people around them that sacrificed children. This is detestable to God. God does not need you to sacrifice your child, to spill blood. But God takes this lesson so much further, because God does not need a sacrifice of any kind. He does not need sheep. He does not need grain. He does not need anything, because God flips the script in the end, and he becomes our substitute. He becomes our sacrifice. You see, the ram in this story of Abraham, the ram in this story is a metaphor for Jesus. This is why Jesus is called the Lamb of God, because just like the ram took the place of Abraham's son, Jesus would eventually take our place, so that a judgment, a punishment, a condemnation that was supposed to fall on us falls on Jesus, and Jesus takes our place. That's what's really cool about this story. That's the lesson that God is starting with Abraham, which he completes in Jesus, pushing the margins out. I will be your sacrifice. I will pay the price. You didn't know how it was going to work out, but I made a way. And that is so cool. That is so cool. You see, in my life, God has been pushing the margins out. And there has been, I've shared this story before. Some of you may have heard it, but I'm going to share it again. And it is a story that tests people's religiosity. It is a story that tested my religiosity. But God used this experience to push the margins out in my life. You see, about 13 years ago, I went back to Uganda. I grew up in Uganda. I went back home to see my folks. I had been living in Ottawa for about 2 years at this time. And when I got home, as I do when I'm going to Uganda, I put it on Facebook, hey, I'm going to be home. If you want to hang out, let me know. And so this young woman sent me a message to say, hey, could you come pick me up at this clinic? Now, I was like, that's weird. But we're friends. Maybe she wants to hang out for coffee afterwards or whatever. I don't know. And so I went to the clinic to pick her up. And when I got there, I said, hey, I'm looking for so-and-so. They were like, go to the back. And so I went to the back. And in the back, there was a basement, really just terrible place. And I got in there, and what I found was that my friend was having an abortion. And they had already induced the labor. And she was going through labor to get the fetus out. Now, everything about my margins, about my experience, was like, run, get out now. And I almost did. Except something kept me there. Something kept me there. I don't know what it was. I pulled up a chair. I sat next to this girl. I couldn't even understand why she had called me to this. But I just held her hand. And she went through the labor. And at the end of it, she was like, it's coming. So I ran upstairs. I got a doctor. He came down with a nurse. They finished. They took out the fetus, and then they handed me, because abortions in Uganda are illegal. And so this was like under the table properly, literally in the basement of a building. They handed me the fetus in a plastic bag and said, get rid of it. I guess they thought I was the dad. And again, everything in me was just screaming, because all I had been told to this point, all I had lived as a good Christian boy, was that this thing is wrong, this is bad, you're not supposed to be here, she's not supposed to be here, there's whatever, those people who march on Parliament building with signs saying abortion is wrong. I did all of that. And here I was in this room, and everything about my experience was saying, get out, get out, get out, get out, get out. But somehow I stayed. I had to figure out a way to bury the fetus. I had to figure out a way to get my friend to a safe space where she could recover, get well, and get medication, and just deal with the mental demons. And my visit to Uganda was supposed to be 3 weeks long. She called me like halfway through my first week, and for the rest of the time, I hardly saw my family because I spent my time with this young woman just in the room that she was. When the weight of everything she'd been through fell on her, she just broke. I didn't know what to do. So all I did was I sat there, I made sure she ate. I just held her, I hugged her. We sang, I sang songs to her. We sat in silence. I wanted to judge her. I wanted to say, how could you do this? How could you get yourself into this? But somehow, miraculously, I did not say any of that. And then after the 3 weeks were done, I came back to Canada. And I didn't know what to do with it. It just messed me up. It pushed the margins in my life so far out, I didn't know what to do with it. I was just carrying this thing. Over the years since that moment, God started to teach me about this word, grace. God started to teach me that you can be in the worst situation in your life, and it's okay. I will hold you. I will sing to you. I will restore you. I will build you up. That no matter what you have done, no matter how far you have gone, my love and my grace are sufficient. The stuff that you do does not shock me. I've seen everything mankind has done from the beginning of time, and what you're going through does not shock me. The stuff that you do does not shock me. You were never too far from my grace and my love. And I started to realize that God had been using this woman's situation as an object lesson for me. I lost touch with the lady for a little while. Then a couple of years ago, we regained touch and whatever, and I was in Uganda. I led a missions team to Uganda, and we were serving at this one church, and it turns out that she went to the church, and so she came to me. This was like 10 years later. She came to me, and she said, I need to talk to you. And I was like, yeah, sure. And she's like, what we walked through 10 years ago, you don't know that that's what started the rescue process in my life. That I could have completely fallen off the cliff if it hadn't been that for the 2-3 most crucial weeks of my life, you just sat with me. There were no words spoken. There was only music sung and music playing, and you fed me and you gave me my medication and you took care of me. I just wept because I hadn't known what to do with this for 10 years. I hadn't known what the lesson in it, what the story in it was. Sometimes we look for lessons and stuff, and I was like, I don't know what to do with this. But God used it. God used this situation that rocked me to my core to start to change my religion, to start to change my religiosity, to start to bend and break the things in me that would cause me to think of myself as better than her, that would cause me to think of myself as better than anybody else, and say, no. You need saving just as much as this person, just as much as anybody else. And so I stand today here as a person. I can confidently tell you that my story is not over. I'm pretty sure that God is going to take me through some more stuff that's going to shove the margins out a little more. God is going to write a new story with my life. I don't know what you have been through. I don't know what situations you have been through. But I know that God's grace is so much bigger and so much higher and so much greater than any circumstance that we can face. That when we reach the edge of our margins, that God is outside of those, letting you know, hey, this doesn't shock me. You know, just like Abraham, breaking Abraham's paradigm, just like me in my personal story, breaking my own paradigm. God is out there. He's outside of all of that. And his grace and his love and his mercy is so much bigger and so much powerful than anything that we can face. So for us who are religious and for us who rail about moral issues and whatever, the story that I've shared could sit with you weirdly. I don't know. It rocked me to my core. Indeed, it still rocks me to my core. But I've been learning, God has been teaching me to put down my conservatism, to put down my condemnation, and to put down my judgment, and to pick up something that is so much better, his grace and mercy and love. And God has used it to write a new story in my heart. He really has. So, to end all of this, what would God say to you this afternoon? What would God say to you in 2018? What happened in 2017 that was just so disturbing that you don't know what to do with it? Perhaps it was God saying, hey, these are your margins. I'm pushing on them. I'm expanding them. I'm showing you that there's something outside there that I want to write a new story with your life. What are you going to walk through in 2018 that is big, that is different? What is it? I don't know. We're just on the 7th day of this year. We have quite a few hundred more days to go. I believe that God is going to challenge you. He's going to draw something out of you. He's going to say, hey, this is the story you're writing. I have a different story I'd like to write. And so I challenge you that when that moment comes, that you sit in it, you stay in that tension and see what God does with it, what story he writes with your life. Because I'm pretty sure he's going to surprise you. Amen. That's all I have to say.